5, we've got the Smiling Man. We've all been there. It's late at night and you're walking around somewhere public. You might be with friends, or you might be totally alone. Out of the darkness, an unfamiliar figure appears. Sometimes they walk on by, slightly creeping you out. Other times, they stare intently at you, leaving you scared silly. There's even occasions when they might follow you for lengthy periods of time, intermittently doing weird stuff or shouting out nonsense. It could be a harmless person having a rough night, but the chance of them being someone who wouldn't think twice about harming you is a tough bet to make. Apparently, the creepypasta The Smiling Man is based on just such an encounter. And plenty of similar encounters have happened since. So the story of the Smiling Man goes a little something like this. There was a person who used to like going on late night walks. They would stroll around their city while their roommates slept, taking in the sights and sounds of a nighttime metropolis. Usually parks and streets would be more or less empty, and this was especially true on that fateful night. Taking note of how extra empty everything seemed, they enjoyed the peaceful stroll. However, out of the darkness came a strange man. This gentleman was wearing a suit and an especially wide grin. At first, he sort of dance-walked towards the storyteller. Unsettled, they decided to walk away from the man. But he persisted, at first continuing to dance walk before performing more cartoonish actions like an exaggerated sneaking motion. The Smiling Man followed our protagonist for blocks and blocks, keeping perfect pace with them, all the while smiling away. I don't think I know a single person who would be unbothered by this. Eventually they stopped in the street and demanded to know why he was following them. And at that point he turned around and started dance walking away. But then he turned around and chased the author. Running away as fast as they could, they eventually ditched the Smiling Man, and let's just say they never went out alone after that. Coming in at number 4, we've got Lavender Town Syndrome. Pokemon fans are already probably quite familiar with this particular tale. There's an old creepypasta detailing these strange happenings that occurred shortly following the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan. Plenty of tales circulated saying that all sorts of Japanese children had killed themselves after playing these games, which what exactly was causing them to act in such a way was up in the air, but people began to theorize that it had something to do with Lavender Town. If you've heard the town theme, you probably understand why people came to that conclusion. It is a creepy, dismal tune. Discordant and unsettling, the song is definitely not the ideal backdrop for a kid's game. Some say there's a sinister tone hidden in there that causes kids' brains to act up. That bit is probably just creepypasta lore though. If nobody's found the true brown tone yet, I doubt there's a kill tone either. Now, all of this was obviously played up for creep factor. There weren't any game-breaking haunted glitches in Red and Green, but there were a few important events going on at the time that likely had an influence on the creation of this creepypasta. First, there was an episode of the Pokemon TV show that caused kids to have epileptic seizures. It was called Den-O Senshi Porygon and involved a scene with some rapidly flashing lights and colors. These high-intensity images triggered reactions in hundreds of children watching. Add this unfortunate event to a spike in the Japanese suicide rate in the 90s and you have a double whammy of creepypasta material. Obviously, these incidents had really nothing to do with Pokemon the video game, but the ideas were planted in our collective minds and made for a very scary story. Coming in at number 3, we've got the Alice killings. I keep reading this one and want to make some sort of connection to Alice in Wonderland, but I can't seem to find anything substantial enough to make a really good link. However, the link between this tale and one of a real-life serial killer is hard to ignore. See, back in 2003, Alfredo Galán Sotillo killed 6 people and wounded 3. Eventually, he came to be known as the playing card killer. Can you guess why? He would leave playing cards with the bodies of his victims. Eventually, he did turn himself into the police, and now he's serving 142 years for his crimes. The idea of a serial killer having a motif is nothing new, but this was definitely a high-profile case and turned some heads. So when a creepypasta turned up with serial murders in between 1999 and 2005, featuring playing cards left with corpses, folks made the connection. In the Alice killings, there was also the fact that Alice was written in blood at the scene of each crime, but that's mostly window dressing that makes the tale unique in its own right. Let's hope that nobody gets inspired by either of these high-rolling serial killers. The last thing we need is more copycats. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Capgras Delusion. A lot of creepypastas make use of this rare psychological condition, even if they don't reference it directly. I'd be willing to bet that a lot actually don't even know about this delusion at all, but are still using bits and pieces in their own work. See, this is a condition where folks are convinced that the people around them have been replaced with exact duplicates. Exact to a degree, however. There are little things that are wrong that seem to tip them off into the direction. Think the hole in the ground as a good example of exactly how insane something like this can get. The delusion itself often manifests as part of another underlying mental disorder, dementia, schizophrenia, etc. It can make people react violently to old friends and loved ones, convincing them that they're doppelgangers trying to harm them. It's not surprising that this is a regularly occurring theme in creepypasta though. Doppelgangers and evil twins are well-established tropes in fiction. All throughout history, yarns about body doubles ruining lives have been spun. The horrifying lookalike that will act in ways meant to destroy you with without anybody noticing. It brings questions of identity to the surface and makes people really worry about their place in the world. And so many creepypastas feature stuff like this. Whether it's a real clone or simply a delusion is up to you to figure out. There's the classic tale of the kid being called down by his mother only to be grabbed by his mother hiding in the closet. "Don't go down there," she says. I heard it too. Another twist in the tale is the kid who can't fall asleep. She tells her dad to look for monsters under the bed, and when he peers underneath, he's greeted by another daughter, claiming that there's something on top of my bed. And of course, there is the Capgras delusion pasta itself, about a woman who was convinced that her younger brother had been replaced by someone else. After she died, her delusion was passed on to her partner, who then couldn't figure out if the boy was real or not. The mind is quite the fragile thing, don't you think? And finally, at number 1, we've got Slender Man, the poster boy for a creepypasta being taken too far, right into the real world. Slender Man is famous for many things. His infamy tends to stem from the stabbing that he inspired, however. This tall, pale, faceless man in a suit has been seen all over the place. Originating on something awful, the lanky lad was photoshopped into the backgrounds of photos, captioned with reports of disappearing children. His fame grew over the years with the help of popular web series and video games. As Slender Man went viral, he simultaneously became the face of internet horror. There was a period of time where nobody was doing anything other than talking about the horrific being. His powers were often exaggerated, but Slender Man was well known for brainwashing people, causing amnesia, inducing coughing fits, and making folks disappear. He would hide in the woods and stalk people from a distance, causing all sorts of weirdness to happen if anyone got too close. 2 12-year-old kids found out about Slender Man, and they took the online tale a little too seriously. They wanted to become his proxies and were convinced that if they didn't kill someone, he would come and harm their family. After some deliberation, these kids decided that they would kill their best friend. Stabbing her 19 times and leaving her for dead, they hoped that Slenderman himself would welcome them into his forested mansion. No such thing happened, as Slenderman indeed is a fictional character. The victim actually managed to drag herself to a road nearby where she was found by a cyclist and rushed to the hospital. The 2 attackers were arrested but found not guilty by mental disease or defect. They are now serving long periods of time in mental health institutions. You have to wonder if Slenderman had all that much to do with the attack or if something was going on beforehand. Either way, it's a cautionary tale about kids' media habits and choosing friends wisely. Clomping its way into number 5, we've got the Goat Man. An example of the ever-present green text creepypasta, this story of a young lad encountering a terrible creature was originally posted on paranormal image board X. The year was 2012, and X user Nancy decided it was time to recount the horrifying experience. Other folks encouraged him to keep telling the story, and it was posted in pieces over a length of time. As more was revealed, other board users either believed him or tried to disprove his tale. Whether it's real or fake, this is a well-written tale of terror. When Nancy was a teenager, he would visit his cousins in Alabama. Being from the city, he would spend a lot of time in the woods during these trips, as it was something he didn't really get a chance to do too often. A group of cousins and friends headed out into the woods to do what teenagers do and ended up regretting ever leaving the safety of town. The story Nancy tells is one of paranoia and unease, as many unexplainable things happen. When you're in a new situation with new people, it's easy to get confused and lose track of things. Mix in the ever-present smell of blood and a gibbering lunatic running through the woods, and you've got yourself a recipe for a nightmare like no other. As the teens try to figure out exactly what's happening, new faces seem to come and go. Friends look for help and come back with new people, while others seem to disappear without a trace. The beauty of the Goat Man is that it really could happen to anyone, and everyone involved seems to be relatively sane and reasonable. The details paint a picture of apprehension, with the core members of the group figuring out that something isn't right, often too late. Fluctuating group counts, ungodly noises, you name it. The Goat Man is a classic example of creepypasta done right. Coming in at number 4, we have The Expressionless. Speaking of classic, The Expressionless drives home all sorts of creepypasta staples. Gory descriptions, a supernatural entity, people just trying to live their lives, an open ending. If there was a ready-made checklist for creepypasta, this would tick most, if not all, of the boxes. Written by TJ Lee, it rapidly gained notoriety thanks to disturbing imagery and creepy accompanying photo. Look into the eyes of that thing and tell me you wouldn't collapse at the sight of it. And while the picture itself is creepy, the story behind it takes it to another level. The Expressionless is the tale of a strange woman wandering into a hospital. She's covered in blood, which isn't too out of place for such a facility, but the kitten clamped between her jaws, that is. All this and the fact that she looks exactly like a mannequin makes it even more disquieting. Her face, devoid of any humanity, is where the name Expressionless comes from. Hospital staff were able to get her into a bed and put restraints on her, but as soon as they attempted to administer some sedatives, things went sideways. Fast. The story isn't too long, so I'll refrain from recounting too much more of it. But what I will say is that it is a vile and blood-filled story with an ending that many have attempted to emulate. If you're in the mood for a quick, largely disturbing read, look no further. Slinking in at number 3, we've got the Russian sleep experiment. If you're a creepypasta aficionado, it's hard to ignore the widespread influence of the Russian sleep experiment. It's equal parts believable and far-fetched, with plenty of undeniably haunting ideas. In fact, it's presented in such a way that a great deal of people believe that it was real. Some still probably do, for being honest. It's that well done. Following the events at the end of World War II, 5 prisoners are taken to a secret location and experimented upon. The subjects are to remain awake for 30 days in a chamber full of experimental gas. What the purpose of the gas is hard to say. Of course, being isolated from the rest of the world and being forced to stay awake for extended periods of time leads to some insanity brewing. And boy, is it a strong brew. Like, literally, these subjects steep in their own filth and madness for the duration of their stay. It gets filthy. A lot of precautionary measures were taken to avoid a situation where things got too bad, and, well, they didn't work. It gets weird and messy and dark and gross almost immediately, and when you think the story's peaked, it goes further. People are torn asunder, drains are clogged with viscera, sleep is avoided, madness is abound, and again, the ending of this one is iconic, with sweeping statements made about humanity. It's been emulated time and time again, but there's a reason people keep coming back to the Russian sleep experiment. I, for one, lost some sleep over it, which is worrisome. I don't want to end up like those guys. But at least I'm not trapped in a chamber of experimental gas. Well, actually, I guess only the lack of gas is true these days. Check this one out if you've ever been scared by the prospect of being a human lab rat. Coming in at number 2, we've got Ben Drowned. Bridging the gap between classic creepypasta and ARG, Ben Drowned is a phenomenon. There's nothing out there quite like it, and believe me, people have tried to make their own glitchy video game wickedness. Sure, there's enough stuff that people have made for the sole purpose of usurping the interactive creepypasta throne, but the fact that Ben Drowned uses an instantly recognizable video game to tell its story makes it so much more relatable, and therefore immediately scary. This could have happened to you if you grabbed a copy of this game. Every time someone boots up Majora's Mask these days, there's a chance you'll have flashbacks to Jadu Sable's story. You've met with a horrible fate, haven't you? Ben Drowned ties together all sorts of different online anxieties. There's the storytelling part, where the author tries to sum up what's been happening in a pretty traditional way. But then clips of a horrifically glitched out Majora's Mask cart are introduced, adding some new media to the mix. Majora's Mask is creepy enough without all the extra storytelling. Like, I can recall being scared absolutely silly by the mask salesman the first time I played this game when I was a kid. That face, that laugh, those masks, jeez. And don't get me started on the moon. God. And then we've got the whole story through the eyes of the onlooking roommate, who does their best to add some sanity to the story. All of this is made even more confusing and rewarding, though, when you realize it's an ARG with interactive elements. The game clips are full of hints. The channel they're uploading to is hiding something. Journal entries and cleverbot conversations aren't exactly what they seem to be. Ben is watching. Who is Ben? Well, you better head over and read the whole thing if you want to find out. And finally, at number 1, we've got Candle Cove. I love the concept behind this one. Apparently it was inspired by an article by The Onion, where a man is still haunted by nightmares regarding a show from his childhood. In Candle Cove, there's nothing inherently dangerous about the monster, so to speak, but the way it's revealed leaves readers feeling super uncomfortable. It's kind of like being gaslit, with nothing seeming real afterwards. Written by Chris Straub in 2009, this forum post-style story has a bunch of perfect strangers discussing a program they recall from their youth. Apparently everyone had forgotten about it until recently, and had the sudden urge to seek out other viewers to reminisce. The show was about a little girl named Janice who befriends some pirate puppets. It seems like a pretty innocent thing to watch at first, but the more the group thinks about it, the weirder their recollections become. What had once been thought of a slightly creepy kids show becomes disturbing and fast. On-screen action becomes gruesome and violent, and the subject matter of the stories becomes less and less coherent. There's even one episode where all the puppets do is scream. Everyone discussing the show remembers just taking it at face value, though. As kids, they didn't think it was that weird. It might have disturbed them, yeah, but what's a kid gonna do about it? As more people look into the history of the show, it becomes apparent that something isn't quite right. And like most good creepypasta, there is a wicked twist.
Kicking off the list at number 5, we have Future Boy. The story is good. You'll like this one, I think. I have 4 sons. My oldest is 6, and he's the one I'm curious about. Since he was very young, first learning how to talk, he occasionally said things that don't make any sense for him to know. Classic kid thing. We were on vacation with my in-laws at the beach when he was 2.5, and he had a blast in the water with my husband and I. Then the next day we got up bright and early to go back, and he adamantly refused. He kept insisting that there were alligators in the water. Now, we tried to reason with him that the alligators didn't live in salt water, but he just wasn't having it. Well, my husband had taken one of our twins, almost a year old, into the water and they were playing. And a few moments later, a man comes running from the pier yelling at him to get out of the water and for us to get away from the water. Interesting, okay. He explained that while watching the water from the pier, he saw an alligator just underneath the water, stalking my husband from a distance. He called 911 and animal control arrived and were eventually able to locate and capture this alligator. And it was 8 feet long. Holy There had been storms during the night and it was mating season. Classic, that's when they come out. So the explanation was that he was looking for a mate and had come in through a freshwater river that runs into the sea. But how could my son have known about that hours before it happened? Interesting. And that's not all, folks. There's more. Another time I was going outside to do yard work and he told me not to go near the bushy tree, fig tree, because there was a rattlesnake underneath it. I thought it was just childhood imagination. I mean, I'm doing the yard work and I go over to that tree to see if any figs are ripe and I heard the rattle. I looked down and lo and behold, 3 feet away was a rattlesnake and it wasn't happy to see me. I quickly got away as not to disturb it further and hoped that it would go on its way. I mean, he shouldn't have known it was there. That's odd. That's just odd in general. Another time, we were going to visit my mom and he was asleep. We hadn't told him where we were going because she had a surprise for him. So we got in the car and he said, you can't go this way to grandma's because the bridge is out. First of all, a kid saying that, I'd be like, the bridge is out? How can you even say bridge? We almost went that way if my husband was driving and the bridge had fully been operational the day before. Sure enough, we get to the bridge and it's taped off with a detour sign. There's no way he could have known because word hadn't gotten out yet, especially since my cousin is the local supervisor and he didn't tell anyone about it until after I called him. I honestly find this a little creepy because I can't logically explain it. Yeah, this is wild. I mean, it sounds like you have to take your kid to the casino with you in like 20 years. This is some Final Destination. This stuff scares me. And like, kids that know stuff, that's a possession right there. That seems like a possession. I don't know. Number 4, the entity that wants my son. Well, this one's great. So one night, my wife's son and I went to stay over at my wife's parents' house. It had gotten dark and my son, who was about 2 at the time, got sleepy, so I decided to put him to bed. Let me try and explain the room to you as it's relevant for later. The door opens on the right side of the room. Immediately to your left is the light switch and the queen-size bed is just beside that. It's a small room, just big enough for the bed and enough room to walk around the bed. The wall in front of the bed has a window. To the left of the bed is a closet with those weird accordion doors. Also, bonus points for calling out those doors. Nobody likes those doors. Get rid of them. They're loud. They're just like, they fold 19 times and you want a shirt. I'm done with those. Let's leave those back in the past. I'm laying in bed with the lights out with my son who is laying his head on my arm. Very cute. He finally falls asleep and I just lie there for a few minutes to make sure he's completely out. And then out of nowhere, I get this horrible feeling. Get goosebumps, hair standing up on my neck and arms. It was such an evil feeling. Have you ever got goosebumps on your scalp where it feels like your scalp is shrinking? Personally, no, and I'm glad I haven't. I did that night, so bad in fact that it literally felt like someone had a hand on my head and was squeezing it. I was genuinely scared, not so much for me, but for my son. Somehow I knew deep down that if I turn away from my son, something bad will happen to him. I thought if I could turn on the light, I could grab my son and leave the room. So where I was on the bed, I could just barely touch the plastic bezel thing on the light switch. I was afraid to move because I knew that if I did, whatever this thing is, will get my son. Also, his head was on my arm the whole time, don't forget. So I finally chanced it. I jerked my arm out from under my son and then I turned on the light. And it honestly took a split second, super fast. When I turned back to grab him, he was at the bottom of the mattress. Like something had pulled him from the top to the bottom in a split second. And I knew he didn't crawl down there because he was still fast asleep. So it made no sense. So I grabbed him and we left the room and slept in the front room that night. Something evil wanted my child. That is truly terrifying. I've seen this before in like, I don't know, 9 different horror movies. That's so alarming. I hope everything's okay. First of all, he's gonna watch this video in 15 years like, what? Number 3, my roommate, the ghost. So I have this resident ghost that has been living with me for around 10 plus years. Awesome. He's pretty funny actually. One time I saw him getting out of my bed and walking into my bathroom. He wore a white long sleeve shirt with ruffles in the middle. He had longish blonde hair and looked like he might have been from the 1700s. I couldn't see his face since his back was turned to me. And I hear music playing in my room sometimes as well. This is not friendly nor funny, this is terrifying so far. Sometimes when I sleep on my couch, I can hear him stomping down the hallway. It's just minor annoyances. I know it's not sleep paralysis or hallucination. It's happened to me so many times that it doesn't really scare me anymore. Today, I was sleeping in and I felt him sit on my bed. He does that sometimes just to be annoying. Classic, the classic sitting ghost. I tried to keep sleeping, but he kept babbling some nonsensical words that sounded like my brother's voice. So I finally had to say it out loud, "Dude, get off my bed." I knew this sounds crazy, but I found it quite funny. Oh yeah, that's hilarious. For sure, who doesn't love a 1700s ghost boy just sitting on their bed and hanging out, talking, and catching up for 10 years? Nice. Also, kudos for being cool with him though. When I was younger, I couldn't even sleep if the laundry pile looked weird. Like if it looked like a person, sometimes I'd have to go and like swat it around a bit just so it looks different. Like it looked like laundry, and then I could go back to sleep. Very good. Number 2, forget something, ? I've had a few experiences now that make me think I have a friendly ghost in my house. Again with the friendly ghosts, awesome. It makes things that I lost and can't find appear in the middle of my bed or on the middle of my desk, when I was absolutely sure they were empty because I was just searching my bed and desk just before that. Here's 2 of my favorite experiences. Okay. This is the first encounter I had with my friendly ghost. I have a door in my room that leads to my balcony, but the doorknob is broken / not well attached, so it falls out sometimes. One time my doorknob fell out and I placed it somewhere, but I couldn't remember where, and I couldn't find it for about 4 days, but hadn't been intensively looking for it, you know? Then my best friend came over and she wanted to smoke a cigarette on the balcony. Don't smoke, kids. But the door couldn't open because the doorknob was of course still lost. So we looked for about 20 minutes and checked if we could open the door without the knob a few times. We decided just to climb through the window to the balcony. It's pretty cool, I mean, seems pretty bad. When we climbed back into the room, we saw that my doorknob was in the door. Not just that, it was attached well and firmly. Something it hadn't been for years because it had been falling off all the time. But I wasn't scared because I saw it as a friendly gesture from the ghost. Another encounter I had was when I was baking a cake. I just made the bottom for the cake. It had to cool in the fridge for 10 minutes, so I put it in the fridge and made the filling. I was done before the 10 minutes were over, so I felt the cake bottom in the fridge to see if it was hard enough already. And it wasn't, so I decided to wait a little bit longer and clean up the stuff that I had used already. Nice, classic cake baking method. Sweet. Then just as I thought I'm going to get the cake bottom out of the fridge now, I see it standing in the middle of the counter. Since I already had the previous experiences with similar things, I knew it was my ghost, and I thanked him in my head. I'm very appreciative of this ghost. I lose a lot of things all the time, and having them appear in obvious places when I'm looking for them is very, very practical. Okay, that's truly frightening. I mean, as nice as that sounds, I would hate a ghost giving me a helping hand. Like, oh damn, where's my charger? Then it just like floats in front of me. I think I'm all set. I'd rather look for like 5 days. And finally, number 1. This is not fiction. Solid name, here we go. I was probably 5 or so. My brother was 7. We shared a room, 2 twin mattresses just on the floor. We both saw a misty figure come through the south wall of the room, and it wasn't human in shape, but it also wasn't a typical spooky ghost. We were both scared and didn't know what was happening. The ghost grabbed hold of me and lifted me into the air, and my brother grabbed my leg, trying to keep me from being taken. Oh my god. The ghost was taking me up and we moved towards the west wall. And at this point I was about 5 feet in the air. My brother was still hanging onto my leg and we were both hysterical. Whenever I read hysterical, I always think about laughing, but for some reason this is probably not that case. As the entity passed through the west wall, I did not, and me and my brother dropped to the floor. So with all the noise we made and the 2 of us hitting the floor, our dad stormed in and started yelling at us. We tried to explain, but he didn't believe us. My brother and I didn't talk about it for 20 years. But when it came up, we both had the exact same sequence of events in our head, even finishing each other's sentences. I know memory is a fickle thing at best, but we both remember it. I remember having the wind knocked out of me when I hit the ground. I remember being picked up, and I remember my brother tugging on my leg and us both falling when the thing passed through the wall. Not only does this sound like an awful night, but to have that happen and then you have a parent not believe you, that must be so stressful. They just start yelling at you minutes after you get picked up by a demon, like, awesome, great sleep, thanks, I have to be up in 5 hours. This is
Coming in at number 5, Abandoned by Disney. That's right, the first creepypasta I'm hitting you with is a Disney related one, hence the clip at the beginning of this video. So after the 1967 animated version of The Jungle Book came out, it was a hit, and Disney decided to begin construction on a jungle-themed resort. In the late 90s, they got to work on this park that would be located in Emerald Isle, North Carolina. The park cost $30 million to build, and it was going to be called Mowgli's Palace. A year later, when Disney was almost finished completing the park, they decided to pull the plug on the whole thing. They left the nearly completed project intact, the gates were chained up, and within days the park was abandoned. And now we get to the creepypasta part. Christopher Wolf shared his pictures and stories of the abandoned park online. So, a few years ago, the park was locked up and Chris decided to break in and check it out. When he got there, he could see a lot of broken locks and some sections of barriers were broken down as well. Once on the grounds, he said that he could feel something was off about this place. There was a bunch of graffiti that always said the same 3 words, abandoned by Disney. Shortly after entering the park, he started to hear whispers, but he thought it was in his head and he continued on to the Central Palace. Once there, he ventured deep into the lobby and saw a stairwell leading down to the only part of the whole park that wasn't defaced. It was a tiny door that said mascots only. He entered the room and went down a long hallway to a door that said character prep 1. He tried to open the door, but it was sealed tight. He turned around to walk away, but then heard a popping sound. He turned back around and noticed the door was now slightly open, so he went inside. In the room, he saw several Disney costumes hung on hooks, except for the Mickey costume, which was left slumped on the floor. He then noticed that the Donald costume was more decomposed than the others. He tried to lift the costume, but then something large dropped out of the headpiece and shattered at his feet. It didn't take long for him to realize that the object that fell was a human skull. Terrified, he dropped the Donald costume, turned around to run out the door, but when he turned around, the Mickey costume was in an upright position blocking the door. Terrified, he tried throwing the person in the costume off by taking a flash picture. It was then that Mickey said in a hushed voice, "Hey, wanna see my head come off?" Christopher ran from the room. He said he blacked out and he can't fully remember how he got out, but luckily he did. Some people have said that this is a hoax, but others believe him as they themselves have some weird stories from the park. But this picture going around online of Mickey definitely scared a lot of people. At number 4, the Russian sleep experiment. When this image made its way online, people were freaking out. Back in the late 1940s, Russian researchers thought it would be a good idea to keep people awake for 30 days straight using an experimental gas-based stimulant. These people were kept in a sealed environment so their oxygen intake could be safely monitored. The researchers needed to make sure the gas didn't kill them as it was toxic in high concentrations. Also, it's important to note that the test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during the World War II. The people who did this experiment were also volunteers, as they were promised their freedom if they took part, but they were never really going to let them go. For the first 5 days, things were going fine. After day 5, the test subjects began to demonstrate severe paranoia. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming randomly for hours on end. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something that they originally said they wouldn't. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives as they were afraid they either died or were vegetables as they were not making any noise. That day, the chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air. And immediately once this happened, the test subjects begged for the gas to be turned back on. They were now dependent on it. They had turned mad and parts of their bodies were ripped apart by the strain of the experiment. Their abdominal organs below the ribcage were removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. It also quickly became apparent that they were digesting their own flesh, that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of a few days. Yeah, that's a really disturbing one. Especially since it's been proven that human prisoners were used as test subjects throughout history. At number 3, Capgras delusion. One of the really popular motifs in creepypastas is that of the doppelganger, which for those of you who don't know is a double or evil twin of a living person. This doppelganger seeks to replace the original. One of the most powerful creepypastas of this type is only 2 sentences long, and it goes like this. I began tucking him into bed and he tells me, "Daddy, check the monsters under my bed." I look underneath his bed for his amusement and see him, another him, under the bed staring back at me, quivering and whispering, "Daddy, there's somebody on my bed." This is a very real and very terrifying disorder known as Capgras delusion. It's the root of many doppelganger creepypastas. The delusion typically manifests as part of another underlying mental disorder, such as dementia or schizophrenia, and causes the afflicted to react violently towards loved ones that they believe have been replaced with an imposter. Coming out at number 2, Jeff the Killer. Yeah, Jeff the Killer. If you've never laid eyes on this image of Jeff, then consider yourself lucky. But I'm gonna show it to you now anyway. Basically, it's said Jeff is a serial killer who hides in the closets of his victims and whispers out, "Go to sleep," before killing everyone in the household. What's even creepier is his appearance. His face is smooth and pale, and he always has a huge creepy grin on his face, and small eyelashes that have no lids. He's easily one of, if not the most recognizable creepypastas. His image has appeared on thousands of forums. In his origin story, it's said that he was in a fight and somehow chemicals burned his face and caused him to go insane. After this, he murdered his family and disappeared into the night to make guest appearances in your nightmares. So many people have claimed to see Jeff and yet somehow escaped. So I mean, you never know. He could be real. Coming in at number 1, Slender Man. This is one I've read all too much about. He's definitely haunted the forums of the internet. Slender Man is a tall, skinny man who has a white, featureless face. He wears a finely pressed suit and has extremely long limbs. Slender Man is said to prey on children in particular, but also those who become obsessed with his existence. Many people have claimed that they have seen this shadowy figure off in the distance, most commonly spotted in the woods, while some say that the Slender Man himself has rung their doorbells. It's said if you do see Slender Man, then he will start to stalk your life. He will look at you throughout your windows as you're sleeping and follow you everywhere. One person who made this claim is a popular YouTuber named Shane Dawson. In one of his urban legend and creepypasta videos, he talked about his own personal experience with Slender Man. There have also been stories in the news of teenagers killing their friends because they claim Slender Man told them to do so. Another teen set her house on fire because Slender Man told her to do so. So yeah, a lot of bizarre stories happening around.
Coming in at number 4, we've got the end of death. There's a strange fixation on death throughout the SCP Wiki. I suppose humans exist to prolong their own lives and prevent our species from ever dying out. The ultimate fear in the back of people's minds is their own death and the inability to stop it, mostly anyways. So it makes sense that there are so many different SCPs directly linked to death. One extra secret SCP details the discovery that after dying we still retain some semblance of consciousness, forced to feel our bodies decompose in the darkness long after we're buried. Another one looks at how the linear, progressive passage of time is actually an anomaly and has caused billions of deaths. No stopping that. But what if death didn't happen? Or rather, couldn't? Welcome to the End of Death Hub. This is a whole separate canon within the SCP Wiki. Plenty of contributors have added to this particular horror story, one in which the entire observable world ceases to experience the effects of death. Immortality is forced upon all life without any other biological change. At first, this doesn't sound so bad, right? Death is scary. We don't want our loved ones to die. We don't want to die ourselves. The other side of that river Styx is unknown and therefore horrifying. So eternal life would be pretty sweet, no? Well, actually, it would be a total nightmare. Death is essential for life to continue. It's natural, it's needed. Without death, many things would be unable to change, unable to grow, and more. Overpopulation quickly becomes a major issue in this sprawling story as organizations and individuals alike seek out ways to keep the growth of everything under control. Also keep in mind that free from death does not mean free from pain and suffering. If you run out of food or experience major bodily trauma, you won't die and just be free from that suffering. Instead, you'll feel it more intensely than previously thought possible. And for longer too. That starvation feeling will never disappear. Those fatal injuries will plague you. Not fun. So if you really want a truly scary SCP story, check out the End of Death Hub, pick through a few entries, and see how awful life without death could truly be. Coming in at number 3, we've got SCP-4000. Listen carefully to this story, because if you mess any of the rules up, you could find yourself in a world of hurt. SCP-4000 is a very strange case. It's a forested land only accessible through weird ritual. Those who do complete the tasks required to travel here show up in a well and must walk down a path until they loop back to the start. During these walks, they will encounter all sorts of anomalous creatures. The creatures that live here come in all shapes and sizes and often undergo horrible mutations. Unfortunately, they're not huge fans of being mutated and can get pretty upset about it. Here's where the rules start to kick in. Do not call anything by a consistent name. Don't answer to a consistent name. Accept any gifts presented to you, but don't use or consume them. And if a ghost tells you that it's not a creature, listen to what it says. Follow these to a T and you might just make it out unscathed. But if you goof up and call something a consistent name, you might end up experiencing some really strange stuff. Creatures from SCP-4000 could appear to you in the real world as terrible hallucinations, or maybe not as hallucinations. Yikes. See, names are powerful things. They anchor a person or thing to their identity. But if we're to believe the stories of SCP-4000, the inhabitants of this world are Fae, banished here without any names or titles. If you give one of these things your name, they might just take it, and from there it can only go downhill. You could find yourself mutating, shifting, or changing without knowledge of why, just like a certain scholar, but we live your life without that.
In at 5, Peter Pumpkin Eater. The story begins with our author looking through his telescope at the moon, trying his best to be quiet because he knew his mother would be upset if she caught him up so late. Everything was normal until a low grumble was heard out in the night. He assumed it was his mother coming to check up on him, so he jumped into bed and under the covers. He heard footsteps, then another grumble. This time though, he could make out faint words. Was his mother talking to someone? The sound began to grow louder, getting closer and closer to his door. It sounded as though a large metal object was being dragged across the floorboards. He shouted out, "Mother, is that you?" But nothing. It became clear that whoever was there was singing a melody, but it was too masculine to be his mother. The noises got louder and louder. Lightning then struck, lighting up the room for a brief moment. Our author could see in the mirror opposite that he was not alone. He leapt out of his bed into the corner of the room, hiding under his teddy bears. He lifted his head, and there it was, a shadowy figure standing in the darkness. The figure then whispered in an eerie tone,
Peter Pumpkin Eater had a wife but couldn't keep her. He kept her in the pumpkin shell, and there he kept it very well. Peter Pumpkin Eater had another and didn't love her. Up the chimney he did shove her.
And that's where our creepypasta ends. In a log added later, it details how the mother and son were found dismembered inside their chimney. No details were left behind, and the killer may still be on the loose. In at 4, a normal Halloween night. This creepypasta documents the final time our author ever celebrated Halloween. When he was 10, there was news that a serial killer was on the loose in his area. That didn't deter him or his friends though. They got dressed up and ventured out for a night of Halloween fun. The first house they went to, an old woman answered the door. She began to panic and said, "Good costume." The kids were confused as they knew their Halloween costumes were subpar at best, but they took the candy regardless. The next house they went to, a similar incident occurred. A middle-aged man answered the door and said, "Jesus, don't scare me like that." They looked at each other confused and responded, "What do you mean?" He replied, "It's a very good costume, nothing more." He then gave them a lot of candy, but our author couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. They then went to a house at the end of the street where a crazy woman lived. Again, they scared her. "Good costume," she said. "That's the best costume I've ever seen." Our author finally broke and responded, "Whose costume?" She replied, "The guy in the serial killer costume behind you." Ugh. In at 3, My Last Halloween. Our author begins this story by describing one particular Halloween when he took his children out trick-or-treating. It was an unspoken rule that you only knock on the doors of the homes with lights on, but this particular night the eldest child wanted to knock on the door of a towering 2-story house that for the past 2 seasons had been vacant. The author had noticed a moving truck parked outside a month back, so he agreed and his children approached. They knocked, but there was no answer. After a moment or two, the door slowly creaked open and a voice beckoned, "Trick or treat." The children cheered. The father felt something was off though and approached before the voice rang out again.
I choose both.
2 hands then appeared, pulling both of the children inside. The door slammed shut and our author pounded and pounded, but there was no response. He then proceeded to kick down the door, shouting out to his children. They searched the house, but to no avail. The children were not there. It has now been a year and there has been no word. In at 2, The Masked Man. Our author in this creepypasta documents a handful of days over the Halloween period with his son James, who was adamant on dressing up as Buzz Lightyear. During the lead up to the big day, our author was preparing for his son's arrival, as he only gets special holidays following the split from his wife. On the night of October 22nd, our author details seeing a creepy man lurking around his property, almost scoping it out. He hid out of sight and peeked through the window, trying to catch a glimpse of who the masked figure was. He drew back the curtains and came face to face with the snooper, who was donning a mask similar to the one from the Scream franchise, only this time the jaw seemed to be swaying in the wind, and it had fang-like teeth. The masked man's left eye began to scan around, drifting away from where it fixated, locating our author. As it did, it disappeared. Now hopping over to October 25th, our author has a bizarre encounter with one of his neighbours that he doesn't know too well. He had placed a bowl of candy outside with a chicken scratch sign that read, "Take one." Oddly though, the sign was smeared in bloody fingerprints. He then recounts how the one and only time he had encountered his neighbour, he was looking distraught and rushing out of his house. He had said that he was late for work, which our author found odd as it was 8:30 at night. The neighbour then said he worked as a biologist at a military base and said no more. Heading into October 28th, our author has yet another encounter with the masked man, This time though it was much more sinister. Our author recalled hearing the sound of a cat screeching. He approached his window and saw the masked man, only this time its entire body. It ran like an ostrich. It was spotted with spindly hairs and blue veins, and its head appeared to be decomposing. The cat hopped a fence and the masked man followed, effortlessly leaping after it. It's now the night of the 30th. At 12:15 AM, our author hears an aggressive knock at the door. He answers. It's the neighbor, but not the creepy one, the one who lives behind him. He accuses him of scaring his wife with that creepy mask. Our author is offended that he could ever possibly think it was him, but pleased that others have been seeing the masked madman. The neighbor goes on to say, I quote, "I saw you jump clean over that fence of yours and crawl right back into your basement." Wait, what? Concerned, he opens the door to see his son just as he had left him, sleeping facing the wall. He returns to the neighbor who says, "Just stay the hell away from me and my family," before an aggressive tone takes over him and a chuckle erupts with bottomless blue eyes emerging, the same eyes he saw outside. He then says, "I gotta hand it to you though. I nearly busted out laughing when I saw you running around wearing your little kid's Buzz Lightyear costume. What the fuck?" In at 1, Trick or Treat. Now this creepypasta opens with the line, "Don't bother trying to find it. You won't find anything about the name of the town or what happened here." Yikes. I'm not sure I want to proceed, but let's proceed. The author begins by taking us back to All Hallows Eve in the old country, and how they were the first to celebrate the occasion as a holiday. He describes how the natives were confused by their behavior at this time of year, but left them alone out of fear. On this night they went out on their settlement, collecting apples and tarts. The author's little girl dressed as the Queen of England. Thank you, sir. She promised to return after sundown and not to linger too long at the households of the community. I'm getting nervous. The community was unaware of the house at the edge of the settlement until children began to enter. It was unlit and had no windows or fire to speak of, but the house seemed to be shimmering. Our author questioned it, asking other settlers about the house, but they all thought him odd, saying, "What do you mean? There's no house there. They're going to play by the stockades." He decided to venture out towards the house the children were heading towards, and what he saw through the cracks of the house unsettled him. He drew his knife, entering the home, but when he got inside he knew his knife would be useless against the forces inside. There he saw a black cloud, entering the nose and mouth of his daughter, as well as the rest of the children from the settlement. But before he could react, the black smoke entered him, and before he knew it he was outside of his body, watching on at the horrors around him. They were led back to the settlement into the meeting hall. Parents embraced their children happily, and this is what led to the destruction of their little community. They absorbed them all, and this creepypasta is a warning to read the signs and not stray into the settlement known as Roanoke.
Humans have always had a fascination with the terrifying and the bizarre, telling stories of terror to each other in order to feel the thrill of fear. These stories are told around campfires, in books, and in television and film. But in the internet age, one of the most popular ways to share scary stories are creepypastas. Hello, I'm Andrew Boyd, and though I live out a horror story every day while trapped in this lifeless void, I can still appreciate a good scary story. These are the top 5 creepypastas you need to read in 2023. Number 5. Candle Cove. Candle Cove is a creepypasta told in the format of a blog post. It starts out with users reminiscing about a television show they all watched as children. They talk about the various puppets and the relatively low production values in a show about a cowardly pirate trying to search for buried treasure while being terrified by the villain of the piece, Skin Taker. The users realize how bizarre and terrifying the show really was, and wonder how a show like this ended up on children's television. Eventually, one of the users responds with information about the show that puts the entire thing into a terrifying new perspective. Here is a brief excerpt from the story to give you a taste of what you are in for. "Yeah, I think so. Remember his mouth didn't open and close? His jaw just slid back and forth. I remember the little girl said, 'Why does your mouth move like that?' And the Skin Taker didn't look at the girl, but at the camera, and said, 'To grind your skin.'" Oh, I'm so relieved that other people remember this terrible show. I used to have this awful memory. A bad dream I had where the opening jingle ended, the show faded in from black, and all the characters were there, but the camera was just cutting to each of their faces, and they were just screaming. And the puppets and marionettes were flailing spastically, and just all screaming and screaming. The girl was just moaning and crying like she had been through hours of this. I woke up many times from that nightmare. I used to wet the bed when I had it. I don't think that was a dream. I remember that was an episode. No, not possible. There was no plot or anything. I mean literally just standing in place crying and screaming for the whole show. Maybe I'm manufacturing the memory because you said that, but I swear to God, I remember seeing what you described. They just screamed. Oh God, yes, the little girl, Janice. I remember seeing her shake and the skin taker screaming through his gnashing teeth, his jaw careening so wildly I thought it would come off of its wire hinges. I turned it off and it was the last time I watched. I ran to tell my brother and we didn't have the courage to turn it back on. This creepypasta is immensely popular and was the basis for the first season of the television program Channel Zero, showing that the story's horror is enough to transcend its internet roots. Number 4. Smile Dog. Smile Dog tells the story of a young internet journalist trying to uncover the mystery behind an internet rumor of a photo of a smiling dog that apparently causes anyone who sees it to be haunted by an evil spirit who will only leave you alone if you show the photo to someone else. The man eventually tracks down a woman who claims to have been haunted by the spirit for 15 years, and she warns him never to look at the photo before ending her own life. He then checks his email and discovers that someone else has sent the photo to him. Here's a brief excerpt. According to my email client, there was one file attachment called naturally smile.jpg. I considered downloading it for some time. It was most likely a fake. I imagined, and even if it weren't, I was never wholly convinced of smile.jpg's peculiar powers. Mary E's account had shaken me, yes, but she was probably mentally unbalanced anyway. After all, how could a single image do what smile.jpg was said to accomplish? What sort of creature was it that could break one's mind with only the power of the eye? And if such things were patently absurd, then why did the legend exist at all? If I downloaded the image, if I looked at it, and if Mary turned out to be correct, if smile.jpg came to me in my dreams demanding I spread the word, what would I do? Would I live my life as Mary had, fighting against the urge to give in until I died? Or would I simply spread the word, eager to be put to rest? And if I chose the latter route, how could I do it? Whom could I burden in turn? It is an eerie story, reminiscent of The Ring, and a quick and fun read for anyone wishing to be suitably spooked. Number 3. Gateway of the Mind. Gateway of the Mind is a short but effective creepypasta that tells the story of a scientific experiment gone wrong. The scientists believe that sensory deprivation will allow a man to converse with God. So, they take a volunteer and put him through a surgery that severs all of his senses, leaving him unable to feel anything or do anything except tell the scientists what he is experiencing. At first, it seems to be working, and the man seems able to talk with the dead, but things soon take a dark turn. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. It is a disturbing story about scientists playing God with forces they don't understand, all in an effort to meet God, and it is well worth a read. Number 2. The Expressionless. The Expressionless is a short but creepy and extremely violent creepypasta about a strange-looking woman who shows up at a hospital exhibiting strange and violent behavior that only gets more and more disturbing as the story goes. Here is the beginning of the story to get you hooked. In June 1972, a woman appeared in Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, California, in nothing but a white, blood-covered gown. Now this in itself should not be too surprising, as people often have accidents nearby and come to the nearest hospital for medical attention. But there were 2 things that caused people who saw her to vomit and flee in terror. The first being that she wasn't exactly human. She resembled something close to a mannequin, but had the dexterity and fluidity of a normal human being. Her face was as flawless as a mannequin, devoid of eyebrows and smeared in makeup. There was a kitten open, clamped in her jaws, so unnaturally tight that no teeth could be seen, and the blood was still squirting out over her gown and onto the floor. She then pulled it out of her mouth, tossed it aside, and collapsed. The story only gets darker and more violent as it goes on, so if that is the kind of story you love, this may be the tale for you. Number 1. Baby Monitors. Baby Monitors is a suitably spooky creepypasta about a boy who discovers that if he buys a baby monitor, he can prank new parents by hijacking their monitor's frequency to scare them into thinking that their baby is in danger. He goes to different neighborhoods on his bike, messing with people until one night he picks the wrong house. Here is a brief excerpt. Just as I was about to give up and leave, I heard a strange, moist gurgling sound coming from the monitor. The quiet, rhythmic snores ceased, and I assumed the baby had woken up and was about to start crying. Instead, a man spoke to me. "You're the one being watched now, Juan," he said softly. My stomach pirouetted at his words. How did he know my name? I felt sick. Something was very wrong, and I could feel it in my bones. I glanced up at the nursery window and saw a silhouette standing there watching me. Had he been there the whole time? The air was thick and difficult to inhale, though perhaps fear was making it hard to breathe. My body quivered uncontrollably as a sense of dread poured into every inch of me. I climbed on my bike, pedaling desperately to get away. Part of me thought I was overreacting, but the overwhelming need to flee overpowered my rational mind. "You can't run. I know where you live, Juan," continued the man, even as I turned the corner. I flew down the street, not stopping until I reached a busy boulevard, surrounded by cars and a few late-night joggers. I felt safe. "Your hoodie will run red with your blood, boy," whispered the man, still talking through the baby monitor in my pocket. It is a satisfying story about someone learning the hard way not to engage in scaring people if you cannot handle being scared yourself, and it is a quick and very fun read.